So good evening and welcome to our presentation on meat alternatives. My name is Susan McBride and I'm co-hosting with Mike Edding tonight. The reason we chose this program is because there has been an increase in the amount of meatless alternatives that are available on the market right now. Meat alternatives are plant-based foods that can be consumed in place of meat. In some instances, they do not even resemble meat and are not meant to. They are merely plant-based foods that are high in protein and other nutrients that your diet would lack if you are not consuming meat. In other instances, they are absolutely meant to mimic meat and to make you feel like you are really eating meat. For those products, if you did a side-by-side comparison, you would probably be able to pick out which one is the plant-based product and which one is the legit meat product. But most people who have chosen to reduce or delete meat from their diets are happy with a reasonable facsimile. But we're going to get into the specifics of how they can compare later in the program. This is just my disclaimer and something to consider as we begin our discussion. So plant-based meat is having a bit of a moment right now. You can find plant-based meat items at many fast food restaurants. You may not even have been aware. So all of these chains that I have pictured here offer some kind of plant-based meat alternative at their stores. Dunkin' Donuts, Nathan's Hot Dogs, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King, Buena Beef, Subway, even White Castle has plant-based sliders today. In 2020, the plant-based meat market was valued at about $4.3 billion, and it's projected to nearly double and reach $8.3 billion by 2025. So the reason behind the growth is probably partly the awareness of the health benefits of reducing your meat consumption, but also recognition of the sustainability of a plant-based diet as compared to a meat diet with meat in it. So despite this projected growth, industry watchers say that there are really two main obstacles to the vegan meat industry really taking off. The first is cost. And in general, commercially sold vegan meat imposters cost a lot more than their meat, the meat that they're replacing. So many times it's double or even more than that. So for example, Gardein chicken nuggets, which is a vegan chicken nugget that Mike's going to talk about a little bit later. But a half a pound of Gardein chicken nuggets costs the same as 2 pounds of Tyson nuggets. So there is a big difference with some products in terms of cost. The second obstacle to the vegan plant-based meat really taking off is a perception that meatless products don't taste very good. So tonight's program is aimed at informing you about the different options for meatless meat that are available commercially or that can be made at home. We'll cover what they are and how they compare to real meat in terms of taste, texture, nutrition, and even sustainability. So we're going to start tonight by talking about tempeh. Maybe you've heard of tempeh before and wondered what it was. Tempeh is a soy-based product that does not really make a great meat impostor, but it does make a great meat alternative. Tempeh is a fermented whole soybean product. It originated in Indonesia, and it's been around for a long, long time. Tempeh is made by soaking soybeans overnight. Then you boil them for about 30 minutes. Drain off the excess water, and the beans are placed on a tray and they are fed with a fungus, the I'm going to mess this up, but the Rhizopus oligosporus. And then the beans are allowed to ferment either at room temperature or even at a higher temperature. And during this fermentation process, which is 1 to 2 days, you can see this white mold begins to cover the beans and kind of binds them together into a solid mass. And that's what tempeh is. Vegans like tempeh because it is really unprocessed. In terms of your meat alternatives, it's probably the least processed meat alternative. It's made from whole legumes, whole grains. It's nothing has been done to them. Tempeh is soy-based, just like tofu, but tofu has been processed to make almost like a soybean cheese. Tempeh is not processed, and it's the whole grain. So therefore, it has plenty of nutrients and it has a lot of fiber too. Because it is fermented, it's much more digestible, and many of the nutrients and antioxidants that are in it become easier to absorb because of the fermentation. So tempeh has a pretty strong, nutty, fermented flavor that most agree need to be dealt with. So to decrease kind of that funky fermentation flavor, you can slice it up and steam it for about 10 minutes before you marinate it or do whatever you're going to do to it to prepare it and cook it for your meal. It's also important to note that as proteins go, tempeh is significantly more sustainable than beef. But it's also more sustainable than chicken or pork as well. So soy tempeh creates about 94% less CO2 emissions than beef, 78% less than pork, and 62% less than chicken. So it is much more sustainable than animal meat. There are several different ways to use tempeh in your meals. You probably wouldn't just slice it up as a piece of meat like you would chicken or beef as your main dish. But tempeh does have a firmer texture than tofu, and it can be a substitute, a satisfying substitute for meat. You can slice it into sheets. You can cube it like you see in this picture here. You can cut it into strips. You can even grind it up a little bit to give it a texture that's similar to ground beef. Most of the time, you're going to want to marinate tempeh and cook it with some kind of sauce or something that adds some flavor to it, because otherwise it's got a pretty strong flavor on its own. It's popular in stir fries, and the flavor of tempeh pairs really nicely with peanut sauces or even with teriyaki sauces. When you crumble tempeh, you can add it to a bolognese sauce, or you can cook it as you would cook sloppy joes and make sandwiches out of it. Another popular way to treat tempeh when you're with vegans is to marinate it and cook it in such a way that it replaces bacon. And you use liquid smoke and maple syrup and a bunch of other flavorings. And then you can fry it in a pan. Like I said earlier, tempeh does not replicate meat. You know that tempeh bacon, for example, is not actual bacon. It's not trying to fool you. But if you choose to remove meat from your diet, the meatiness of tempeh can be satisfying, especially when it's enhanced with meat flavors, like soy sauce and Worcestershire sauce and things like that. Just remember to steam it for 30 minutes before using it in your recipes to get that kind of funkiness out of it. So let's give a little nutrition information about tempeh so you can see how it stacks up nutritionally against its meat competitors. Because tempeh is typically just fermented soybeans, it does make sense that it is low in calories, fat, and cholesterol compared with most meats. Chicken is a pretty close rival. One reason tempeh is used by vegans and vegetarians as a meat substitute is because it is pretty high in protein. And unlike meat, tempeh is also high in fiber, which is an added bonus. And tempeh doesn't have any salt either on its own. Many of the preparations for tempeh do have a salt component, like a soy sauce or actual salt, which will add sodium, but you have control over that when you're cooking to make sure that it's as low sodium as you want it to be. And as I mentioned before, another benefit of tempeh is that it is made from whole soybeans and therefore less processed than other meat alternatives. So that's tempeh, which is probably one of the first generation of meat substitutes or meat replacements. Now we are going to move into seitan, or I pronounce it seitan, but I think the real pronunciation is seitan. It is not a new thing either. It's been around for a while as well. The word seitan is Japanese, and it was coined about 50 years ago by proponent of the microbiotic diet. But the food itself has been a staple in Asian cultures for at least 15 centuries. So it's really been around for a while. Seitan is made from wheat gluten, which is the protein part of wheat that gives bread dough its elasticity and pizza crust its bite. We tend to think of wheat products as being carbs, but wheat is about 15% protein, mostly in the form of gluten. So among the grains, wheat is actually the highest in protein. So there are a lot of commercially available products that are based with seitan or seitan-like mixtures, but it's also a meat alternative that you can easily make at home. And I will be sending out a packet of recipes that I make at home, and I've included a seitan recipe in those if you want to give it a go. Whether you make it at home or it's made commercially, the basic process is about the same. You create this dough that is wheat flour, yeast, and water that's mixed up and kneaded. You let it rest for a while, and then you massage it in a large volume of water. And the starches and the other water-soluble components get washed away and are leached out into the water, and it leaves behind this glutinous mass that's all protein. When you make it at home, you can also, you also add acids and bases like vinegar or baking soda, and that can help manipulate the texture to make it even more meat-like. You can also stretch it in one direction and compress it in another, and you can actually create some fibrous structure similar to the fibers in meat. So unlike tempeh, seitan can be treated as a true meat imposter, and you can make it feel and taste and give you the sensation of actually eating a piece of meat. When you make it at home, you don't have to go through the water soaking and massaging. You can take a shortcut and use a product known as Vital Wheat Gluten, which has already had the gluten removed from the wheat, and that's what you're using, is just the gluten. So you don't have to go through the process of trying to separate out the gluten. You basically make a dough, you bake it and let it rest overnight in the refrigerator, and then it's ready to be used however you're going to use it. Like I said, unlike tempeh, seitan has the surprising ability to mimic what are considered the good qualities of meat: the flavor, the hardiness, the ability to absorb sauces, without the less appealing aspects like the bits of fat and cartilage that some meat has. It is possible to create a meat imposter, not just a replacement, using seitan. Another reason to consider replacing your meat with a seitan product is its impact on the environment compared to meat. According to Thrust Carbon, which is a London-based sustainability firm, seitan has a carbon footprint that is 130 times lower than beef. 100 kilograms of seitan produces about 4.6 kilograms of CO2, compared with 6,000 kilograms for the same amount of beef. So what are the different ways that you can use seitan to create a meat-like product? One of the best ways is probably to sausages. Seitan makes a great sausage alternative. At home, you can kind of shape it as a sausage, and then you can roll it into foil and roll the ends of the foil like you would a casement for sausage and bake it that way, and you create these sausage shapes seitan that then you can cook in a skillet or grill or however you would cook sausage. You can also create a pulled pork type meat substitute. You can make meatballs out of it. You can, if you make a loaf of seitan, you can slice it very thinly and cook it in a skillet and create almost like a gyro meat or even an Italian beef. You can cook seasoned strips of seitan. You can make crumbles, like ground beef crumbles. There are really many ways. It's a very flexible product to use. And you can customize it if you make it at home and add the seasonings of your choice. So if you want to add oregano and garlic and basil, you can make almost like an Italian beef type product. If you want to add sage, rosemary, and thyme, you can mimic almost a Thanksgiving turkey flavor. It's a very flexible product. It has the right texture without the greasy fattiness of perhaps like a bratwurst or a sausage or even a hot dog. Mike will be discussing a lot of commercially available sausages later, but they're easy to make at home, as I said, and you're going to save money doing it this way. You can also substitute the beef in beef with broccoli with slices of seitan that have been cooked and stir-fried. You can put it in stews. You can substitute it for chicken or beef in casseroles or tacos. You can either even slice cutlets of seitan, and there are a lot of videos on YouTube that will show you how you can actually go about creating the fibers of the meat to more closely resemble chicken breasts or pork tenderloins even. So since seitan harnesses the protein of the wheat gluten as you create this meat-like product, obviously if you have celiac or other difficulties digesting wheat gluten, seitan is not an option for you. But if wheat gluten is not an issue for you, then seitan really makes a versatile and surprising meat alternative. In addition to tasting good and mimicking the texture of meat to some degree, the nutritional profile of seitan is another reason to give it a try. As you can see, compared with meat, it's significantly lower in calories and fat, cholesterol, and it even has a decent amount of protein and even iron. While seitan is high in protein, it typically doesn't contain enough of the amino acid lysine to be considered a whole protein, a complete protein. So when you are making seitan or when you're buying it, you can look for or add in a product called nutritional yeast. or even chickpea flour. And both of those will boost the lysine content of your seitan, making it a complete protein. And I did want to mention nutritional yeast. If you're not familiar with it, it is a product that's well known in vegetarian circles because it's an important nutritional supplement in vegetarian cooking. It's basically the same yeast that that's used to make beer and bread and kombucha, but it's just a different end product. It's this flaky kind of dry product, and it's usually or oftentimes fortified with nutrients to make it have a little bit extra food value. But it can be used in a lot of different ways. It's a kind of adds an umami flavor. It's a seasoning that you can put on all sorts of things to add this savory, cheesy, kind of nutty taste. You can even just sprinkle it on popcorn, and it gives it the sensation of being a cheese popcorn without the dairy. So just a little tidbit in if you're looking for something new to try, and you can get this at a lot of grocery stores. We buy it at Whole Foods, I think. So there are a couple of other meatless options that I wanted to mention tonight. As I mentioned at the start of the program, purchasing processed vegan meat alternatives is generally more expensive than buying the meat itself. So one way to get around this is to make meat imposters yourself. So there are several common ingredients that you can turn into meatless meat pretty easily at home. Tofu, for example, is extremely versatile as a meat replacement. And it's great because it's also high in protein and low in fat and calories. One thing that you can do with tofu, and I'm going to include a recipe for this in the recipe pack that I send out after the program. One thing you can do is you can press it to mimic chicken. And so if you buy a super firm tofu and you press it for about 10 minutes between paper towels and get as much liquid out as you can, and then either cube it and marinate it and toss it in your stir fry, or toss it, you shred it and bread it and bake it, you can create kind of a chicken nugget that is pretty closely resembles an actual chicken nugget if you season it properly. You can also crumble tofu and add turmeric and some nutritional yeast and some other flavorings, and you can create something that mimics scrambled eggs. Another thing you can do is you can buy young green jackfruit that comes in a can in brine. And if you shred that and you cook it with your favorite barbecue seasonings, you can make something that very closely resembles a barbecue pulled pork sandwich. It's much more beneficial nutritionally. There's very little fat and calories. It does not have the protein that real pork is going to have, but it does create a satisfying sandwich and a very tasty alternative to actual pork sandwich. I have taken celery root and roasted it, and then sliced it real thin and marinated it, and then I coated it and fried it and made something that really closely resembled a fried fish fillet in flavor and in texture. Another thing you can do is you can bread cauliflower. This picture here is some southern fried cauliflower that I made at home. I also make a buffalo chicken cauliflower sandwich. They make great vegetarian substitutes in terms of taste and texture. But like jackfruit, celery root, and cauliflower aren't going to be packed with the protein of meat, but they are going to be satisfying if you're getting your protein somewhere else. Lentils are a great way to get the protein, and they can be used to resemble ground meat, as well as chopped walnuts. Believe it or not, you can soak your chopped walnuts and then use them to create ground beef type dishes. The lentils you can put into like a bolognese sauce or sloppy joes. Same with the walnuts. And I'm including a recipe for, I think it's a bolognese sauce that uses both lentils and walnuts, that is really quite good. So there are lots of interesting meat alternatives that you can either buy at the grocery store or put together at home. But I did want to mention one other thing. And another way that you can try out vegan meat is by having a restaurant prepare it for you. Vegan restaurants typically have perfected vegan dishes. And so you can be reasonably sure that their vegan Reuben, for example, is actually pretty tasty. So I have a couple of recommendations if you want to try one of them, just to see what you think. There's a restaurant in Uptown. They're all in Chicago too, unfortunately. I can't find one out west. If any of you know any in the western suburbs, let me know. But in Uptown, there's a restaurant called Kalish, and they do really, really tasty vegan junk food for the soul, I think is their tagline. But I have had their vegan Reuben. It's unbelievable. You wouldn't know that there is no meat or dairy in it. I've had their chicken and waffles as well, which is also equally yummy. Another restaurant in Uptown is the Loving Heart Cafe, and they are known for their burgers as well as their wraps. Probably one of the most well-known vegan restaurants in Chicago is the Chicago Diner. And they have 2 locations in Logan Square and Lakeview. They have great burgers and gyros, even vegan poutine. But if you don't do dairy, you want to go there because they have a plant-based milkshake that has no dairy in it that's to die for. And finally, there are several locations of native foods throughout Chicago, and they're definitely a popular chain. They've got great plant-based burgers, wings, and chicken sandwiches. So that's kind of the less processed side of things, less commercial side of things. Mike is now going to take over, and he's going to cover some of the more commercially available meat implasters and give you his experience on taste testing.
Thanks, Susan. Bear with me for a moment while I get my screen going here. As that's loading, I'll just say before we get too far into the discussion of these commercial substitutes that are highly processed, I'd like to share that I'm a regular meat eater, and from my perspectives, there are a few things as tasty as a well-prepared burger. So I'll be casting a relatively critical eye at the commercial meat alternatives in this program, focusing a lot on texture and taste. So if you're looking for one of these commercial meat or poultry replacements, you're in luck because you can find these everywhere in restaurants and grocery stores. They are designed to more closely mimic the flavor and texture of the proteins they're replacing the things that you would find a few years ago. Because they're so dedicated to mimicking meat, as I've alluded to, they require a lot of processing. So it's best not to think of these commercial plant-based meat alternatives as health foods. Instead, think of them as sort of convenient alternatives to traditional proteins, which happen to avoid many of the problems of those proteins. So you'll find brands like Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Gardein, Corn with a Q, Tofurkey, and Field Roast, among many others. And as Susan pointed out, these products are currently much more expensive than their traditional counterparts. And sometimes, as she was mentioning, the way this manifests is, even if the package looks like it's roughly the same dimensions and price as a meat alternative, chances are pretty good that it will contain significantly less product by weight. But the higher cost of these is not really the fault of these plant-based alternatives. While the market is growing quickly, it's still fairly small compared to that of traditional foods So as production increases, I think we'll see prices for consumers to come down over time. And United States industrial agriculture has worked really hard over decades and decades to wring every efficiency out of factory farming and ranching. And they haven't really had the chance to do that with plant-based meat yet, but I think it will happen to some extent. So the first meat alternative I'd like to talk about is beef. So beef has received a lot of the attention in recent years in the marketplace. As I've alluded to, there are a couple of flashy companies making beef alternatives, Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. And the approach of these companies seems to differ from companies that have made products like black bean burgers in the past, as those companies were largely marketing their products towards health conscious vegetarians and vegans. In contrast, Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have spearheaded this effort to make as realistic a product as possible in order to appeal to the mainstream omnivore consumer, as they feel the revenue upside is much greater in that market rather than the vegan and vegetarian market. I would say that plant-based beef is particularly important because meat in general and beef specifically is very resource heavy. It uses a great deal of water, for example, to produce a given quantity of beef. And in addition, plant-based proteins like beef avoid a lot of the food safety pitfalls like E. coli contamination and foreign materials like antibiotics and growth hormones, which are regularly added in beef production, are emitted, making for a cleaner and more healthy product. Finally, cattle production as a whole adds a lot of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Cows emit methane as they digest their food, mainly through burping, despite what you may have heard otherwise. Unfortunately, methane has a much greater impact on our atmosphere than CO2. Some estimates put it as 34 times as harmful as CO2. And a recent study found that beef and dairy production accounts for 14.5% of the world's emissions. If you compare this to the transportation industry, in which all the world's cars, trucks, trains, and ships, those only add up to 14%. So plant-based beef can be a really interesting option and a more sustainable one. So how do they stack up? Well, that's what I wanted to know when I started this process. I tried the Impossible Whopper at Burger King over the weekend, and the first thing that I noticed when I took a bite was the texture. So in my mind, the perfect burger should be loosely packed, making for a fairly tender mouthfeel, but I found the Impossible Whopper's meat to be just a little dense, kind of like a preformed beef patty you might find in the freezer section. Otherwise, I thought the texture was pretty good though. In terms of flavor, I thought it was good. When I took my first bite, I got a hit of the Burger King flame broiled taste that they brag about, which was nice. And I tried a bit of the patty by itself, and I could tell it wasn't a beef burger, but the difference between sort of a normal beef burger and the Impossible Whopper was really decreased when you add all the normal accompaniments of lettuce, tomato, mayo, etc. So if meat were taken away from me and this was my only alternative, I wouldn't be heartbroken. It was pretty decent. Impossible Foods has come under fire in some corners for its burger ingredients, specifically because they use genetically modified soy in order to produce a product called heme. And heme is the ingredient that gives the Impossible Burger its realistic meat juice flavor. In terms of genetically modified ingredients, I should add that most food scientists feel that there's not really any health risk to eating these kinds of modified foods, but I thought I'd mention it because some consumers find it a little bit off-putting anyway. So you can find these meatless beef alternatives in grocery stores all over the place. They often come in frozen patties, but they're also available in a ground or a crumbled form. So I found that Mariano's is a pretty good place to get your plant-based proteins. And Susan tells me that Whole Foods has a good selection scattered throughout their store, but most grocery stores, honestly, will have some options available. In terms of nutrition, these new beef alternatives, especially the ones that take the form of burgers, are not necessarily that much healthier for you. That said, if you look at iron, you'll find that the burger products have more iron than traditional 80% ground, 80-20 ground beef. They're also lower in fat, which is important as well. But something that really jumped out at me was the Gardein beefless ground, which I think would be a great alternative to browning ground beef for a recipe like American style crispy tacos or the spaghetti bolognese that Susan was mentioning. The fat in this product is really low while still providing a decent amount of protein. And I think they use soy as their protein source. The Gardein product has a relatively mild taste, which means that it would do well with highly seasoned dishes, or again, those with a sauce. So I think we'll move on to sausage next. I was really surprised, frankly, at the variety of plant-based sausages that are available. You can find hot dogs, brats, breakfast sausage, links and patties, and even a plant-based chorizo. So these products behave a lot like their meat counterparts, browning very well when heated. And how do they stack up in terms of taste? Well, first of all, I tasted the Beyond breakfast sausage patties as well as the Beyond sausage brats. And the breakfast patties I felt had a nice firm texture. The texture of the brats was not quite as pleasing to me. It was a little mealy, but not really too far from the real thing. And as far as taste goes, I thought both the flavor of the brat and the breakfast sausage were good. I could tell it wasn't meat, but it was still tasty. Another small detail, as I was cooking the brats, I immediately noted a brat-like cooking smell. They have a distinctive smell when you're cooking them, and they really nailed that with these Beyond sausage brats. So I definitely get the breakfast sausage again, and I would happily keep a package of the Beyond brats on hand. And availability, most places, most grocery stores, chains like Starbucks are even offering breakfast sandwiches based on sausage alternatives. So how do they fare nutrition-wise? They do pretty well. Compared to traditional sausage, they're lower in calories, they're lower in fat, they're lower in sodium and higher in iron. So it does seem like they do have some clear nutritional advantages. But sausage isn't really what you go to if you're looking for something healthy. So it's not a high bar to clear. Next up, I'd like to talk about chicken. There we go. So chicken, again, is widely available. You can get them as patties that have been breaded, tenders that are the same way, nuggets, as Susan was mentioning, as well as in the form of sort of bare or seasoned shreds or strips. And while industrial beef production causes greater environmental issues, factory chickens often suffer from much worse living conditions than cows do. They're kept in exceptionally crowded buildings and fed until their legs and joints can barely support their weight. Because they've been bred to gain weight rapidly, this really adds to the problem. So as a chicken eater, this kind of gives me pause. And I wish companies spent more money and effort making the process more humane. So I think that's really a big reason why it's important to have plant-based chicken alternatives, which avoid this whole chicken production cycle. Now, how do they stack up taste-wise? I tasted a couple of different products from Gardein. I had their 7-grain crispy tenders and their ultimate chicken fillets. I have to say that I was really impressed with the texture of these breaded chicken alternatives. I tried the tenders first in my air fryer, and they came out really nice. so much so that I didn't think there was much of a chance of another chicken product beating them as far as texture goes. That was until I tried the ultimate chicken fillets from Gardein as well. And these are the ones that are in the black bags. The texture after cooking these in the air fryer for like 18 minutes was really, really good. The breading was very crispy, and the patty itself felt very chicken-like. In taste, neither of the Gardein products were exactly the same as chicken, but I didn't really mind. I made chicken sandwiches with a Southern Creole sauce and some tangy dill pickles, and the flavor fit right in. Overall, I found them to be really satisfying. And for me, I think my tasting revealed that plant-based chicken is maybe the alternative protein to beat, much to my surprise, as everything I'd been reading about before this had been about the beef products, the burgers. So you can get these at most grocery stores. You'll likely have a lot of different choices in terms of chicken products, but I do recommend the Gardein's products. They're uniformly very good. So let's talk nutrition. One thing that jumped out at me was how well the 7-grain chicken tenders did with regard to nutrition. They're low in fat, they're low in calories and sodium compared to traditional chicken strips or patties. In fact, the only product that did better than these Gardein 7-grain chicken tenders was the Foster Farms shredded chicken, which obviously has no breading and is made from breast and rib meat. But you can see it still stacks up pretty well with the Foster Farms product. So I also included my favorite traditional breaded frozen chicken product, which is the so-called red bag chicken at Aldi. I know that this makes reliably tasty chicken sandwiches and has a devoted following on the internet. But as a meat eater, I was really impressed with how the ultimate plant-based chicken fillets compared to those red bag chicken breasts from Aldi. In fact, I think I like the texture better in the Gardein product as opposed to the real product. So I came away really impressed. And that goes for all the products. The burgers and sausage were certainly reasonable facsimiles of their traditional counterparts. And the chicken was beyond impressive to me and really surprising. So in the future, I know I'll be adding some of these products into my diet, which is exactly what these companies are hoping for, because I'm the omnivore consumer that would be most receptive to these kinds of things, I think. I'm not prepared to ditch meat and poultry altogether, but I really feel better knowing that we have some good quality alternatives available to us. So that's all I have about the commercial protein alternatives and meat alternatives. Are there any questions that you have about some of the content that we've talked about tonight? Or if you have any, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things because there are a couple of products that I wanted to mention that that are worth trying as well. Field Roast is one of the companies that you mentioned, Mike. Field Roast makes a couple of sausages that are, if you buy those, I forget the name of the brand, but those chicken sausages that are seasoned with maybe apples and sage, or, they have different seasonings. Field Roast makes some sausages that would be really close comparisons to those that have a nice flavor, a nice texture. Again, they're not sausage. They don't have the skin or the snap, but they do make a great alternative to those and very tasty. But the other thing that they make is a hot dog. If you just feel like if you crave like just a Oscar Mayer hot dog, or, not a high end, really, good hot dog with a nice snap, but just a basic hot dog, Field Roast makes a really good hot dog alternative. That if you put it in a bun, you would never know it wasn't an actual hot dog. And that's probably because hot dogs barely resemble real meat. They're so processed. And then another product that we like is, it's called soyrizo, I think. It's soy-based chorizo that Trader Joe's sells. And you can put it in anything. And again, you besides not being quite as fatty as real chorizo, it's a really good alternative. It's soy-based, obviously, healthier, but it's got a nice chorizo flavor. So those are just a couple of other products that I wanted to mention because they do make nice alternatives. And let's see, we have, oh, thank you. We have a compliment. Does anybody have any other pieces of information that they want to share with the group about their meatless adventure, or do you have any additional questions? Well, if not, that does conclude our program. We will be sending out an evaluation form, copies of the slides, and then the recipes that I mentioned to you in case you want to try making something at home. And we really appreciate you joining us tonight. I hope you've learned something.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yes.
We appreciate it.
Hey, Susan, one question. Oh, in the western suburbs, where do you buy the tempeh and the seitan?
So the tempeh, they sell at Trader Joe's. Gosh, I'm pretty sure they would sell it at Whole Foods, but I do know they sell. I buy it at Trader Joe's.
Trader Joe's, okay, thank you.
And then the seitan, let's see, they do have like a seasoned seitan at Whole Foods.
Whole Foods, okay.
Yeah, I make it though. I've never bought it other than like like field roast sausages are seitan basically. But they do have that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, great. Well, thanks for spending the evening.
Good.
Thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You were the only question?